Chapter 6. And we're going to be reading from verses 12 through to 16. That's correct, isn't it, David? Yes, I've got it right. There we go. 12 to 16. And their houses shall be turned over to others, fields and wives together. For I will stretch out my hand against the inhabitants of the land, says the Lord. Because from the least of them, even to the greatest of them, everyone is given to covetousness. And from the prophet, even to the priest, everyone deals falsely. They have also healed the hurt of my people slightly, saying, "Peace, peace," when there is no peace. Were they ashamed when they had committed abomination? No, they were not at all ashamed, nor did they know how to blush. Therefore they shall fall among those who fall. At the time I punish them, they shall be cast down, says the Lord. Thus says the Lord, stand in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths where the good way is, and walk in it. Then you will find rest for your souls. But they said, we will not walk in it. Amen.
You're all waiting for something, aren't you? We're on our third session of history. I think most of you have been for the first two and you're still here, so you've struggled through to the end. But it'll be finished today, but we'll have to go fast. We've got 400 years to get through. But I think it's appropriate that this particular study comes up on this particular day, on Remembrance Day. I think that's appropriate. People do say, forgive and forget. That's not the wisest advice, that, you know. Forgive by all means. That's essential. But forgetting can be very dangerous. If you were walking down the street and a little old lady coming towards you suddenly whacked you around the head with her handbag, the next time you walk down the street and saw her coming, it would be wise to duck. Not to forget what happened last time, because you just end up with a repeat of the same circumstances. And around the world today, we can see things being repeated that have happened before. In fact, after the Great War in 1918, it took less than 30 years for it all to happen again. People forget only too easily. We need to remember what has happened in the past, and the study of history, as a Christian, the study of history is important to make sure that we don't forget. If you don't know what happened, then we need to know and we need to remember, because we have national leaders now in politics and in the churches who have no understanding of the history of this country, or indeed the history of Europe, and indeed we have other people who are deliberately trying to rewrite it and rewrite history as they want it. And we get that particularly from some of the minority communities. Important, for one thing, to remember that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the Muslim Grand Mufti of Jerusalem in the early 1940s, who I believe was the uncle of Yasser Arafat, whose name you will know, he stood shoulder to shoulder with Hitler throughout the early 1940s. And the plan was that if Hitler succeeded in eliminating the Jewish people from Europe, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who would be the leader of the Palestinian people today if he was still around, his plan was, Hitler succeeds in Europe, he would continue to eliminate the Jewish people in the Middle East. That was the plan. It didn't work because God intervened. And God intervened at a price of a loss of an awful lot of lives. My father's many friends did not come back. My dad did, of course, but many of his friends did not come back. And today, particularly, we need to remember, because just the other day, 2 days, I think, before the 86th anniversary of Kristallnacht, Kristallnacht in Berlin was the beginning of the Nazi pogroms against the Jewish people, and just 2 days before the anniversary, in Amsterdam of all places, there was what I understand was a pre-planned and organized to go on a hunt for Jewish people, apparently, in the streets of Amsterdam. People have forgotten. People are too trusting. Perhaps a Christian preacher shouldn't say that, I'm not sure, but people are too trusting and too gullible. They believe what they're told by the mainstream media and others who have an agenda, and they have forgotten what has happened before. And the danger is it will happen again. Anyway, just looking through Jeremiah 6 there, I just noticed that this morning I've scribbled, this is extra, this is an extra for you, a free extra, just scribbled down some notes as I'll just look through this passage, because it's intriguing. I know it refers to the Jewish people, I know that Jeremiah was referring to other things, but we can take scripture to mean what we need it to mean to us at the time, if you see what I mean. It means more than just what it was written for, and we can see this happening today. From the prophet even to the priest, everyone dealeth falsely. That's the religious leaders today. They deal falsely with the scriptures and with church people. And it's verse 14, they have healed also the daughter of my people slightly. And we can take that. The Reformation, as we understood it, did not go anywhere near enough. It only healed things slightly. It only went so far. And much of what was wrong before the Reformation is still wrong in the established church today. Saying peace, peace where there is no peace. That is, finding a false security in false religion, in a religion that is dead and cannot help. They were not at all ashamed, verse 15, neither could they blush. Church leaders in fancy vestments, standing proud in their apostasy. Stand ye in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths, and walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your souls. The old paths, of course, are in here. This is what we should be living by. This is what we should be reading and studying, and this is the way that our lives should be led. Look for the old paths, not the new and the fresh and the entertaining, but the old paths that are trusted. Psalm 77 says, I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I will remember thy wonders of old. So today is about remembering, a study of history from the Reformation years onwards. I shan't ask you any questions about the first two sessions because it would be embarrassing. But if you can't remember, you can always go back and listen to them again. Psalm 89 verse 1 says, I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. With my mouth will I make known thy faithfulness to all generations. That's what I'm doing this morning, or trying to do this morning. And Hebrews 11, which is well known to you, talking about Abraham, says he looked for a city which has foundations, whose maker and builder is God. It's sad that within the evangelical churches, and perhaps particularly in some of the charismatic movement, there is very little real understanding of the history of God's dealing with his people in this land over the years. Through the popularity of the ecumenical movement, historical details have been muddled, and a false idea of the church has been accepted by many. It is well said that if we don't learn from history, we'll be doomed to repeat it. And it's true that if we do not cherish and value the past dealings of the Lord, then we will never learn to appreciate what he is doing today. It's important for all believers to fully realize that the devil's ploy has been to provide an alternative way of salvation in opposition to that laid down in the gospel, and that he has always used false religion to come against the truth of Christ. Since the birth of the Christian church in Acts chapter 2, he has maintained his energy behind a false church, a demonic deception designed to turn the hearts of men away from the biblical path. And it is all the more dangerous because sometimes it looks very much like the real thing. And I've said it before, the closer it is to the real thing, the more dangerous it becomes. We've already got as far as the 16th century, and we now come to the period famously known as the Reformation, although I have to say again that the Reformation wasn't necessary amongst those who continued to believe the pure gospel displayed in the Scripture. And thank the Lord, there were always a minority of them. And I think we left it last time with the Lollards, the followers of John Wycliffe, who 100 years before the Reformation were out preaching the gospel around the streets and fields of this country. We shall see that the God who used both Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar in his purposes continues to use all kinds of people to bring about the fruition of his plans, whether they themselves are believers or not. As we have seen, we've just had an American election. Who knows what God is going to do with the changes that he has made? Not because of who people are, but despite what people are. Isaiah 37, Isaiah talks about God putting a hook in the nose and leading people in the way that he wants them to go. And we have leaders all around the world today who think they are doing their thing. The devil thinks they're doing his thing. But actually the truth of it is God is putting hooks in noses in these days. And as we get up to the period of the Lord's return, that is going to happen more and more often. And nations are going to be led into the place where Scripture shows them in the book of Revelation. God uses all people for all kinds of reasons. In the 15th century, that's the 1400s, England was very much taken up with the Wars of the Roses. I have to be careful saying this, don't I? A Yorkshireman in Lancashire. But of course it was nothing to do with Yorkshire and Lancashire. You can forget that idea. The Wars of the Roses was a fight between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Nothing to do with Yorkshire and Lancashire as such. And this, what's it called, the Plantagenet period, came to an end after Edward IV died in 1483, and before his son was old enough to reign in his own right. And the king's brother in 1483 was the Duke of Gloucester, who was from the House of York, and he took guardianship and claimed the throne in his own right, and he was crowned Richard III. He was incidentally brought up much of his young life in various Yorkshire castles. But traditionally, historians have taken for granted the story that Richard III murdered his brother's children. You've heard of the princes in the Tower, I assume. But this picture, the picture of him as a hunchbacked, deformed madman who murdered his brother's children, that was the picture that was painted by Shakespeare. It's Richard III in Shakespeare that you get that idea from. If you look at pictures that were painted of Richard III from the time, there's no sign of a hunchback or any deformities of any kind. And he was brought up looking after his brother's children. I've had a look into it, and I think he was a very loving uncle to his brother's children. But the picture that was painted by Shakespeare, this is the point I'm trying to make. Shakespeare was writing in the 1600s, and he was writing for Queen Elizabeth I. And he had an interest in making Richard look bad because it made Henry VII look good. Because when Richard was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, the last time a monarch was actually killed in battle, Henry VII became king. Now, did he have any right to the throne? That's a big question. But portraying Richard III as a monstrous child murderer suited Shakespeare, because Shakespeare was reliant on Elizabeth I's support in what he did. So just like today, people will portray somebody to be good and bad because it suits them and suits their issues. We have to be careful when we read history that, just a minute, who's writing this? History is always a well-known fact. History is written by the victor. And sometimes you have to look into the people who lost that particular battle to try and find more of the true story. Henry VII of the Welsh Tudor family, which is where the Tudor rose comes from, because the Tudor rose is a mixture of the red and white roses of York and Lancaster. At the end of the Wars of the Roses, the Tudor rose was supposed to show the coming together of the two. And he became king on Bosworth Field in 1485, and his son, of course, was the very famous Henry VIII, who became king in 1509. And here again we see the moving of the hand of God, I believe, behind the scenes, because Henry VIII as a child was not expected to be king. That's a direct parallel with our own Elizabeth II. When Elizabeth II was a child, she was not expecting ever to be queen. She only became queen because her father's brother abdicated. And Henry VIII was not expecting to be king. His brother Arthur was older than him, so he should have been king. But Arthur died as a young man, and Henry had married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, who was from the royal house of Spain. You recognize the names today. You might not have known many of the names last time, but today you'll recognize the names. And Henry and Catherine had a child, a girl called Mary, but did not receive the much wanted blessing of a male heir. You have to understand that in those days it was very important to have a boy to carry on the traditions of the family, particularly if you were royal. And as the time went on, Henry VIII fell in love. For real, I think. Which was very unusual in those days, because, of course, as you married people know, there's very little to do about love. Marriage was nothing to do with love in the days of Henry VIII. In fact, for the royal family, right down to today, I don't think marriage has been very much to do with love. It's all to do with working out your dynasty, matching your children with other people's children to gain more power. That's what always went on. But having been married to Catherine for some time and had one child, Mary, Henry fell in love with a woman called Anne Boleyn. There's evidence that Anne Boleyn was a Christian believer, plenty of evidence if you look for it, and she was unwilling to become the king's mistress. So Henry sought a divorce from Catherine by claiming that his marriage to his brother's widow wasn't valid. Was perfectly valid, all right, when he got married, of course, that suited him. But when it no longer suited him, he tried to maintain that because he'd married his brother's widow, that wasn't allowed by the church. And he asked the Pope on that basis for an annulment of the marriage so that he could marry Anne, who he loved, but also he had a hope of getting a son from Anne. But the Pope was dependent upon the emperor, who happened to be Catherine of Aragon's uncle in Spain. So the Pope didn't want to offend Catherine's uncle by annulling her marriage against her wishes, so he kept out of it. That was the main reason he said no, and he refused to allow it. So after a big fuss, Henry broke with the Vatican, as every school child used to know. And as well as he broke with the Vatican, but he was actually excommunicated in 1538. They both broke with each other. But that break was nothing to do with faith or belief. It was purely for his own convenience. And lots of his supporters benefited from the dissolution of the monasteries from 1537 onwards, when they got their hands on some considerable property. Because the land was taken off the Catholic Church and Henry handed it out to his friends. Now, these sort of things go on in politics to this day, of course. He bribed many of his supporters with wonderful riches that were taken from the Roman Church. The big question, of course, is why did the Roman Church have so many wonderfully vast riches in the first place? But there you go. Henry continued to believe until he died. As far as I know, he continued to believe all the essential doctrines of Rome, minus the primacy of the Pope. That was the only thing that he fell out over, the authority of the Pope. We see this again and again and again. We saw it with Thomas à Becket about authority. Who's in charge of the country, the Pope or the King? But as far as Henry was concerned, there was no spiritual change in his life. He lived and died a devout Roman Catholic. His title, Defender of the Faith, which is still on our coins today, was given to him by the Pope. He wasn't the defender of the faith, of the Protestant faith. He was defender of the Pope, defender of the faith on behalf of the Vatican, because he had been so diligent in burning heretics. That's how he got that title. So when there's a big fuss in evangelical circles, people make a big thing about our present king still being defender of the faith. We do need to remember where that title came from. Defender of the faith meant burning Protestant believers. And this was when he fell out with Sir Thomas More. Do you know him? You've seen the film A Man for All Seasons. It's a load of old nonsense, a lot of it, like the film about Thomas Becket, because Sir Thomas More refused to help him with the divorce. This was although it's portrayed in the film and elsewhere, Thomas More was a martyr who died for his Roman Catholic faith and was later canonized and made into a saint. The church that I grew up near was the St. Thomas More's church. This was actually another falling out over authority. There is no evidence that there was any difference in belief or faith between Thomas More and Henry VIII. They both believed all the same things as far as religion was concerned. The one thing they didn't agree on was authority. And Thomas More refused to support the king's divorce because he was supporting the Pope and Catherine of Aragon and her uncle. So not very long after his second marriage, Henry grew tired of Anne, who had only managed to give him another daughter. Sorry, ladies, it does sound a bit sexist, this period of history, but this is how it was in those days. Anne Boleyn gave birth to another little girl who was called Elizabeth. Remember that? Evidence believed by many, including me, to be false evidence, was presented to show that Anne had been having an affair. I think that was made up. There's plenty of evidence to show that. It was because Henry had now got tired of her and had only got another girl, which was not what he wanted, so she was executed for her trouble, and Henry married Jane Seymour. That's not the actress, that's a different Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour died giving birth to another child, Henry's third child, but this one was a boy named Edward. His mother died giving birth to him. This is all important because it's a foundation stone of our heritage that these three wives all had one child each, and they all took the throne in their own right. The only time in history that's ever happened. A half-brother and two half-sisters, each with different mothers. When Henry died, power-crazed, unhealthy, and hugely obese, so fat they could hardly stuff him into the coffin, his son ascended the throne. That is because of, you know this, don't you, the law of primogeniture. You know that, don't you? I can tell just looking at you, you know that. The law of primogeniture means that the eldest son inherits. Still the case in most well-to-do families. If there's a stately home that costs millions a year to run, the eldest son inherits the estate. The second son always used to go into the army, and the third son, who was probably completely useless, he became a bishop. That was how it was done, because there was nothing else for him to do. But the primogeniture implies that the eldest son always takes precedent, and that has always been the case until now. And now, I don't know whether the law's been changed, they're certainly trying to change it, so that they tried to change it so that our present Prince William, if he had a daughter, she would inherit. But that no longer applies because, of course, his eldest child is a boy anyway, so they might wait now and try a bit later on. But Edward, who became Edward VI, had been seen very little of his father, but he had been well taught in the Protest faith by his teachers and by the leaders of the Church of England under Henry, including Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. And Edward was only 10 years old when he became king, but he showed a serious spiritual understanding and a serious ability, and he wrote several important works which you can still read before he was 16 years old. He played no small part in the production of the Book of Common Prayer, and he was known by many, still is referred to by some historians, as the English Josiah. If you read the story of Josiah in the Bible, he was a young king who brought the nation back to God. And there is a book called The English Josiah, which I can recommend you buy, a Christian book, which tells his story. He was known as the English Josiah because of the way in which he pointed the nation back to the scriptures. Most of the important reforming decisions were made during his very short reign. He continued spiritually what his father had started temporally. Sadly, Edward was a sick child, and he finally died at the age of just 16. And tragically, he suffered great pain by being kept alive by quack doctors who tried all sorts of terrible things that made him suffer most terribly at the age of 16 until he finally died, because they wanted to keep him alive until they'd sorted out a successor that suited them. So there was just as many faults on the Protestant side as there was on the Catholic side, and it suited them to have the right successor in place, so they kept this boy alive in pain and miserable until they'd finally sorted it. But he died, I'm certain, he died a saved, believing Christian. And as he died, he whispered to his tutor, "I am glad to die." After the production of a somewhat convoluted family tree, which anybody can do if they try hard enough, the Protestant ascendancy thrust Lady Jane Grey onto the throne. You might have heard of her. There's a film about Lady Jane Grey called The 9 Days Queen. And I saw a version with Helena Bonham Carter in the role, and that was actually quite good, I have to say. The conversation that Helena Bonham Carter's character, Lady Jane Grey, the conversation she had with her priest in this condemned cell before she was executed, I felt that was put over in the film quite good. The priest was almost converted in the film. She was a believer, and she had great theological discussions with the priest and with the people who were against her, who tried to get her to recant from her evangelical faith before her execution after just 12 days. She was never crowned officially as queen, but she was only around for 12 days. Because of the rightful heir, of course, was Mary, Henry's surviving oldest child. And she was the daughter of the scorned Catherine of Aragon. She was fanatically supportive of the Roman religion, and she hated her half-sister Elizabeth, because Elizabeth, remember, was the daughter of the woman who had supplanted her mother. And that's where the hatred came from. England immediately became once more Romanist by decree, and anyone who disagreed was treated very harshly indeed. Archbishop Cranmer and the bishops Ridley and Latimer were among many ordinary people who died at the stake during Mary's short reign. Burning was the punishment for heresy. We need to remember that, because these deaths were for no other reason than their refusal to accept the doctrines of the Pope and the doctrines of Romanism. And they stuck to the teaching, faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone, which the reformers were famous for. William Tyndale, who had translated the Bible into English, took refuge in Holland, but he was betrayed and executed at this time. It needs to be stated that the punishment of burning was not for rebellion against the sovereign. None of the people who gave their lives for their faith at that time, as far as I know, none of them disputed Mary's right to be queen. What they disagreed with was the Roman Catholic religion that she brought back into the country. So their deaths were entirely for religious reasons. They were loyal subjects of the English Queen, but they didn't believe what they were told they should believe, so they were burnt. Now, it has to be admitted that people also died in the ensuing reign of Elizabeth. Catholics died. Priests who came in from abroad to try to bring back the Roman religion were executed, but they were not burnt. They were hanged. Sometimes hanged, drawn and quartered, which is not very nice, because their crimes were not simply an act of religion. They were not martyred simply because they were not Protestants. They were executed because of sedition against the Queen and the state, which is what it was considered to be. So the two different kinds of deaths, burning for Protestant heretics was simply because of faith. Execution by hanging was because the offence was seen to be sedition. They were traitors trying to bring in not just a false religion, but as we've seen in the other sessions, a false foreign authority. An authority that claimed to be higher than the Queen of England. That was the difference between the two sets of executions. Mary the First, known as Bloody Mary, not the drink, but that was her title. She married Philip, King of Spain, who was obviously a leading Roman Catholic, and his eye was on the English throne for his son. And she was desperate to have a child, not just to continue the line, but because she was a woman who really wanted to have a child. And you have to feel sorry for her because for some reason she was unable to. And you have to have some sympathy with this tortured woman who was very, very unhappy. She had a miserable marriage. She had a miserable husband who cleared off as soon as he found out he wasn't going to get the heir he wanted and left her to struggle. She was so traumatized by it, she suffered at least 2 phantom pregnancies, one of which some people say went on for 18 months. And because people, she was the queen and she was in charge, nobody dared to actually tell her, after 18 months, love, you're probably not actually pregnant. But it went on. But you can understand, she was a traumatized and very sad woman, but a deeply, deeply religious woman who believed that burning people at the stake was doing God's work. And she remained convinced that she was serving God by promoting what she saw as the old religion. I've got a question for you here now. If you really think you're pregnant and you almost think you're going in, to have a baby, but you're not, is that what's called laboring under a false conception? Just thought I'd slip that in. When Mary died in 1558, the nation rejoiced. People danced in the streets when they heard that the Queen Mary had died. And her half-sister Elizabeth ascended the throne. And she reigned for 45 years, which in those days was a very long time, because she didn't live that long in those days. A period which almost all historians agree were England's truly great years. She was a staunch member of the established Church of England, and although she was tolerant compared to Mary, she had no time at all for dissenters or nonconformists. You had to be a member of the Church of England, and you had to abide by their rules, and you had to attend the church, and you had to pay your tithe into the Church of England. Even if you didn't go to a Church of England church, if that was the case today, you would have all had to go down the road to the parish church, hand over your money before you came here this morning, because it was just not allowed to go to church anywhere else. There were no other possibilities. In 1559, Parliament passed the Act of Uniformity, in which all English citizens were compelled to worship according to the Book of Common Prayer and the Anglican sacraments. So the Romish prohibition of freedom of worship was passed down and incorporated into the supposedly Protestant Church of England. And as it also was in what's called the Lutheran Church, still today, in Germany. That's Isaiah's, where we started, Isaiah's healing slightly. Improving things a little bit on what they were, but not going anywhere near far enough. The establishment of a national church meant that membership of the church was by citizenship, not by acceptance of faith. You became a member of the church by being baptized as a baby simply because you were born in this country. And strangely and sadly, an awful lot of people believe that today. An awful lot of people who are going to hospital and they're asked to fill in the forms will tick C of E simply because they were born in this country. They might never have seen the inside of a church since they were christened, but they consider themselves to be Christians because they are members of the established church simply because of their citizenship. And that is still a problem today. Augustine's doctrine of the church, which we talked about a long time ago, his doctrine was that the church was the guardian of the means of salvation and you could not be saved outside it. And repetitive popes maintained that there was no salvation outside the Roman Church and outside the authority of the Pope. And even John Calvin, this is where I have to be careful now with some of you, even John Calvin instituted a state church in Geneva. Fanatical Protestant, of course, who did much good and had an awful lot of truth, but he established another state church by which all residents of Geneva were expected to be a member of, whether they were saved or not. And he actually was responsible for the execution of supposed heretics who did not conform to his established church. You see how the thing is passed down from one to another. In 1588, of course, what happened in 1588? I think I heard it. I don't know who said it, but I'm sure I heard the right answer. The Spanish Armada, of course. 1588, the King of Spain tried to take by force what he had failed to get by marriage, because Mary was now dead, and he sent the famous Armada, which was beaten back and wrecked around the coast of northern Scotland and Ireland. I think some poor souls ended up on the Isle of Lewis, if I remember rightly. What a place to end up. But contemporary commentators at the time called it a Protestant wind. That was how they described that event, that this storm came up, and instead of invading England, they were driven right up the coast, right round the top of Scotland, right round Ireland, and only a few of them managed to struggle back to Spain. An awful lot of them died. Meanwhile, Scotland, because we can't forget Scotland had seen the reign of Mary, Queen of Scots. You all know about her, one of the most romantic, foolish, ridiculous figures in Scottish history. She was married as a teenager to the Dauphin. If you read 1066 and all that, they say it was a dolphin. It wasn't a dolphin, forget that. She did not marry a dolphin. She married the Dauphin, which was the title of the heir to the throne in France. As a teenager, she married him and became Queen of France. But he died as a teenager, so she came back, no longer wanted, came back to Scotland to take her place as Queen of Scotland. So by the age of about 16, she'd already been Queen of two countries. The reformer John Knox in Scotland had taken the Scottish Reformation slightly further than the English one, and the leadership of the Church of Scotland was, and still is, a Presbyterian. That is, the governing of the church is by a presbytery of ministers and people. There are no bishops in Scotland, in the Church of Scotland. The established Church of Scotland is Presbyterian. If you're an Anglican in Scotland, you are an Episcopalian. Don't mistake the two. The Church of Scotland is not the equivalent of the Church of England. It's completely different in the way that it is run. Not necessarily very much different in what they believe, but in the way it's run, it's very different. And there were no bishops. Mary, Queen of Scots, was a devout Catholic. And she tried to reassert Romanism into Scotland. She had another very unsuccessful marriage. Her husband, Bothwell, died in an explosion in Edinburgh under very suspicious circumstances. The house blew up and his body was found at the end of the garden and apparently had been strangled. And if that's not suspicious, I'm not sure what is. But there was one man who was suspected of being the leader of the gang that did away with Mary's husband, and that was Lord Darnley. So what did Mary do? She married him. She married the man who everybody suspected was responsible for the murder of her first husband. Darnley was even less successful than the first husband. He was a complete waste of space, and he died insane in prison somewhere in Scandinavia, and Mary was forced to abdicate the throne of Scotland. She fell out so much with all the leaders, she basically made such a mess of it that the leaders of Scottish Parliament said to her, you will have to push off. She ended up actually going to war against her own people. And they finally said that, we've got to get rid of her and her little baby son would take the throne of Scotland as King James VI. And he was only about 6 months old at the time, so there was a long time to go. But so she fled. She took refuge in England. She wasn't kidnapped by Elizabeth I. Forget that idea. She fled across the Solway from Dumfriesshire to Carlisle because she was only going to be safe in England, and she threw herself on the mercy of the Queen of England, Elizabeth, who was her cousin. And that wasn't a good idea, and Elizabeth kept her locked up until 1587 when she was finally beheaded. She was beheaded because she was seen to be a risk against Elizabeth's own position on the throne of England. There were people in the background all the time plotting and planning. As long as Mary was alive, there was a possibility of her taking the throne. So in the end, Elizabeth and her courtiers decided they would have to do something about that. But she was considered to be a repeated threat against the reign of Elizabeth. They were cousins. But again, forget the film. People grow up watching films and they have all these ideas that are complete rubbish. Sophie Loren, was it, that was in the film with Mary and Elizabeth? And Elizabeth Taylor, I think it was. Think of those two people. They both starred in the very well-known film, and they had this one. But it's rubbish. They never met each other. Elizabeth and Mary never met. Mary was kept in prison. If you believe all the history books, if you believe all the guidebooks for the various castles around England, she must have spent at least one night in prison in every single castle in the country, because everybody has a claim to her. It was a sort of a very early Shearing's holiday, I think, that she was on. She went all round the place. But eventually she was executed. When Elizabeth finally died, she had never had any children. She was known, of course, as the Virgin Queen. Whether she was a virgin or not is another question, but that's what she was known as. She never married, so she never had any children. She didn't even have any illegitimate children. Men, of course, could do that quite happily without getting into trouble, but women couldn't. So Elizabeth, as far as we know, remained chaste, and she carried on until quite an old lady. She'd been queen for 45 years, and she died finally in 1603, and she bequeathed the succession to Mary's son, her cousin's son, who was James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, with the union of the crowns. The crown of England and Scotland joined together in 1603. Not the parliaments, but the crown. And James vowed to uphold the established Church of England. There were several attempts on his life. When was the main one? What day was the main attempt on James's life? November the 5th, well done. November the 5th was the famous attempt on James's life when a group of Catholic gentlemen formed around Guy Fawkes, who was born in York, and they tried to blow up the king and the whole of Parliament and replace James with a true Catholic monarch. That was the idea. James may or may not have been a homosexual, possibly was, but he did authorize the printing of the Bible so that the common people could read it for themselves. And that's why I have the King James Version, or the authorized version. It says at the front, it's authorized by the Prince James to be read in churches. He had nothing to do with the writing of it. He was a very religious man. He wrote an enormously long book all about demonology. If you ever get really, if you really can't get to sleep at night, you can get one of those and have a read of it. But he was a very religious man, and he persecuted an awful lot of people who he thought were witches. He had some very extreme ideas, but he did maintain the Church of England, and he was responsible for the authorizing of the translation of the Bible into the English language and the putting of a Bible into every church. And of course, from that point on, if you had enough money, you could buy a Bible yourself and read it for yourself. The first time in history in this country that was kind of freely available, although you had to have the money. And of course, it coincided with the invention of printing, which again, in God's mercy and in God's time, before the invention of printing, it would not have been possible. And that has been a great blessing of the Lord to this country and across the English-speaking world down through the centuries. James died, I'm going to have to speed up, aren't I? I can can feel him growling down the back of my neck. James died in 1625, and his second son, Charles, reigned as Charles I. His older brother had died. Strange, isn't it? He wasn't intended to be king either originally. His older brother had died. Charles was not trained as a child to be king. Charles I was a very high Anglican, many would say Catholic in all but name, and he married a Roman Catholic wife from France. You see this again and again in history. A foreign influence behind the throne, a Roman Catholic. And that is why, up until the crowning of our present king, it was still against the rules for the monarch to marry a Roman Catholic. That's not just prejudice or discrimination. There was a reason for that, because of what had happened again and again in history. Charles was married to a Roman Catholic French wife. He believed in the divine right of kings, that kings ruled directly under God without the necessity of parliament. His decision in all things, spiritual and temporal, was law, or so he thought, rather like the Pope also thought. Amongst other things, Charles I tried to force an Episcopalian system of bishops onto the whole church, including the church in Scotland, and they did not take very kindly to that in Scotland. And there was a woman called Jenny Geddes, I remember, who went to a church at the Kirk in Edinburgh, and she threw her stool at the bishop and said, "Will you no say mass in my lug?" I think that's what she said. And that was the beginning of a fight back by the Presbyterian Church in Scotland against the imposition of bishops. If it was happening today, King Charles would be forcing us to accept the authority of a bishop, of his own appointing, over this assembly. You see the problem? It's unbiblical. So by that time, there were many dissenters, also from the weakened Church of England, but more so in Scotland. Charles taught that he was sovereign, and under him were the bishops. Parliamentarians like Oliver Cromwell and other Christians believed that men and women only answered to God in spiritual matters, and that his will was understood from the Scriptures. Encouraged by his French wife, Charles forced the necessity of a fight against his own parliament and his own people, which was known as the English Civil War. There's been more than one of them, but that's the main one. And Charles I was finally beheaded in 1649 as a danger to the people. And Oliver Cromwell, who refused the crown, became Lord Protector of England. In those days of Puritan government, 1649 to 1665, the country was founded on Christian principles and the biblical teaching of the freedom of individual belief. And never before had religious people been able to celebrate their own faith in their own way like they were at the time that Oliver Cromwell was leading the country. He also allowed Jewish people back into the country for the first time since 1290. So he did a lot of good. I liked him because he made Christmas illegal. I like that idea. I'm with him on that one. Because he considered Christian to be too pagan for Christians to have anything to do with. And that was in 1649. Imagine what he'd think about it if he saw it now. Images and icons were taken out of churches, crosses and ornate vestments were thrown out, and much of the stained glass was broken. And some historians go wild about the destruction of all these wonderful things by Oliver Cromwell and his men. But that is what he did. And when Cromwell died, sadly, his son Richard Cromwell just was not of the same kind of man, and he was a failure. So the people got rid of him pretty sharpish, and they asked the king to come back. Charles I's son, who had been brought up in France in exile, they asked him to come back at what was called the Restoration, and he came back as Charles II. He was a Catholic, married to, wait for it, a Portuguese Roman Catholic woman. He reverted immediately to Episcopalianism, the rule of the church by bishops, and he began to forcibly inflict this ungodly regime of unsaved bishops on the people of England, who had up to this time enjoyed complete freedom of belief. And Charles forced upon Parliament the Act of Uniformity in 1662, which made it illegal for a church minister to preach or practice without agreeing to the rule of the bishops and without bowing in matters of religion to the king before God. So I wouldn't be allowed to do what I'm doing. You might be pleased about that, but I wouldn't be allowed to be here. Nobody would be allowed to preach unless they were a registered member of the Church of England and had signed a piece of paper to say that they agreed with the way that the church was being run. So in 1662, we had what was called the Great Ejection, when over 2,000 ministers of the Church of England were forced to give up their churches, their homes, and their livelihoods because they placed the gospel before expediency. If only they would do the same thing today. People are too comfortable in their posh houses and their palaces and their chauffeur-driven limousines. It's too much to give up for the sake of faith. And that was the same there. But over 2,000, what we would call now vicars, came out of the Church of England. They had to give up their houses and everything that they had to do that. John Bunyan was one of the men who suffered greatly, and he was imprisoned for years simply for preaching the gospel and teaching the freedom of conscience. And the wonderful thing is, while he was in prison, he wrote Pilgrim's Progress and other things, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners and other things. If he had not been sent to prison, we would not have had Pilgrim's Progress, probably. In 1664, the Conventicle Act was passed, which made illegal the gathering together for worship or prayer of more than 5 people anywhere other than an established Church of England under the leadership of a Crown-approved minister and bishop. If you believe that the Lord wanted you to worship in a little dissenting meeting house like this, it was illegal. In 1665, it was followed by the 5 Mile Act, which came into law, which meant that a godly minister who had come out of his church was not allowed to approach within 5 miles of his old church or his old home. And of course, there was no transport in those days. 5 miles was a lot further than it is today. You know, I've traveled a lot more than 5 miles to get here. But if I was walking, I wouldn't have come from Shipley today if I'd been walking. But 5 miles was a long time. So faithful believers were once more persecuted for their faith, and they were driven to meeting secretly undercover or in the open air in private places. This being persecuted by a supposedly Protestant established church. You see what I mean about them being healing slightly, not going far enough. This was more keenly felt in Scotland, where under John Knox the Reformation had gone further, and in Scotland the church was Presbyterian without bishops and without answer to the crown, and those who fought the enforced imposition of regal power on the church became known as Covenanters. They had signed a covenant to stand together against this opposition, and many suffered and died for their faith. Groups of Christian people meeting in the open air were hounded and murdered by Charles I's soldiers, the dragoons. And if you go to Wigtownshire, just to the west of Dumfries, you can see there's some memorials. I've been. It's quite remarkable. There's a large gravestone there, and there were 3 women that were drowned because they refused to accept the bishops having authority over their personal faith in Jesus. And they put the old woman further down the beach so that when she drowned, the young woman would recant. But she didn't, and they all drowned. And you can go and see their graves, and you can see the inscription, the poem that was written on the grave there in Wigtownshire. Very interesting what happened. And that's not that long ago. Charles died in 1685. The throne went to his younger brother James II, who was the 7th of Scotland. He had escaped to France before Charles I's execution. He'd been brought up by a Catholic mother in a Catholic country, and he began immediately to build on the church of his brother, once more imposing a Roman Catholic system on Protestant England. He tried to carry things too far, James II, and much of the populace rebelled against his attempts. The barons and parliamentarians of England and Scotland had had enough of James II. He got so much opposition that he actually cleared off abroad and tried to fight his own people with Irish soldiers. And Parliament invited William, Prince of Orange. to come over from what's now Holland to take the throne. He came by invitation, not invasion, in the light of James's failure to uphold the rights and freedom of his people. And by the fact that James had gone abroad, he was considered to have abdicated. So William was invited to come. William was James's son-in-law. He was married to his daughter, who sadly is also called Mary. Everybody's called Mary in history. He landed in 1688 and together took the throne jointly with his wife. That's the only time in history there's been a king and queen both crowned. I'm trying to go too fast. Both king and queen were crowned. It's the only time that's ever happened, and that's known as the reign of William and Mary, for the simple reason they were both crowned. See, the Duke of Edinburgh was never crowned king, was he? We only ever had Queen Elizabeth. He was not the king. The same reason why Camilla is not the queen. Whatever you call Queen Camilla, she's not actually the sovereign of this country. She's not being, in her own right. But William and Mary both were crowned, and James lost all about his support of his erstwhile subjects, and he resorted in desperation to using an Irish army to fight his own people. He escaped to Ireland, effectively deserting the throne. He sought sanctuary in the city of Derry, or Londonderry, and here the town elders of Londonderry were afraid to confront him. But the apprentice boys of the city went and shut the gates so that he couldn't get in. And that's why in Northern Ireland today, on the 12th of July, they still have an apprentice boys march, and they play the whistles and whatnot, and they have the Orange Order, which comes from William of Orange. And that's why Ian Paisley, of fond memory, used to say, 1690, no surrender, because that was what happened on the 12th of July, 1690, at the Battle of the Boyne, when James was finally defeated. 1689, William and Mary instituted the Bill of Rights, which set out the rights of the people and the limits of constitutional monarchy, which is what we have today. And that was followed in 1701 by the Act of Settlement, which effectively barred any Roman Catholic or anyone married to a Roman Catholic from becoming monarch. And at this point, the parliaments of England and Scotland were also joined together. So the monarch now reigns according to the will of an elected parliament and according to the accepted rule of law. And whilst King Charles now is still supreme governor of the Church of England, which is a problem because he's not saved, but he has no spiritual authority over believers who dissent. The monarch rules under God. So he's not over our church. The Archbishop of Canterbury has nothing to do with this fellowship. We do not have to listen to him or take any notice of him. Evangelical faith, the faith once delivered to the saints, according to Jude, continued to be preached through the next century with the Wesley brothers, George Whitefield and others, seeing the blessing of perhaps the greatest spiritual revival this country has ever seen, because it didn't come from nowhere, you see. The groundwork had all been done. People today pray for a marvelous revival. I don't believe the Bible teaches there's going to be a marvelous revival in the end days, but people say today, if only we could have revival. But revival doesn't just come from nowhere. We can't work it up. Revival isn't worked up, it's sent down. But there has to be provision for revival. There has to be preparation for revival. And what happened in the days of Wesley and Whitefield, it was the right time because the country was ready, because of where it had come from. Down through history, God has breathed the life of his Spirit upon faithful believers. They have founded a movement which has in time returned to the customs and traditions of organized false religion, and the blessing has been lost. And another group of believers have proved to be open to the Spirit's prompting, and a new period of revival has broken out, often with the opposition of what was left of what had gone before. It's a price that has been repeatedly paid because of the temptation for mankind to always to fall back on his own works instead of trusting simply and wholly in the risen Savior. When God moves upon his church, it isn't just Christian believers who benefit. Most things people take for granted today have come out of the days of great revival when men read the scriptures and believed them and put their faith into action. William Wilberforce and John Newton were instrumental in the abolition of the slave trade. Ashley Cooper, better known as the Earl of Shaftesbury, was hugely used in the formation of safer working practices and laws limiting the working hours of children in the Victorian mines and mills. Sunday schools, public education, trade unions are all the result of the Christian heritage and evangelical faith of this country. Our duty is not to let things go. To join with the ecumenists is to hand the family silver to the burglars in the hope that they'll look after it. It is not our option to waste what has been achieved over the years. It is the heritage that we should cherish, and it is not ours to give away. Countless men and women have paid the ultimate price because they believed in things which today the woke rewriters of our history would say wasn't important. Gospel truth is today being openly attacked by the purveyors of multiculturalism and the movers and shakers of the demonically inspired globalist movement and the shadowy truth benders of the Gnostics and the New Agers. But most dangerously of all, the evangelical faith that we cherish and for which we owe our very foundation is being undermined and opposed by Satan's great satanic deception, a counterfeit religion with the goal of leading men away from the truth of Christ and into the syncretistic hodgepodge of man's own imagination. And sadly, our present king is very much at the center of that, as appears to be his son. Right. Our job is to carry the banner, to keep the light shining, to preach Christ crucified and to stand in his strength and by his power in the face of the principalities and powers which would thwart the purposes of God if only they could. Do we care enough? Do we remember enough to keep the flame burning? Is it important enough to us that we should not be ashamed to know the Lord and to defend his cause? We continue to stand on the rock of Christ, the Son of the living God, and not all the powers of hell will ever overcome it. When we sing an old song, it will be worth it all when we see Jesus. I'll finish.